chapter 24. Let's go that route. What we're going to look at this evening is the events that happens in chapter 24, and quickly, or I guess if we have as much time we have left at the end of the class, we're going to look at the first two chapters of 1 Kings, because these two chapters wraps up, in my opinion, the life of David and some of the hanging events that we see throughout the book of various people that we don't want to leave unnoticed what happens to them. So anyway, 2 Samuel chapter 24. As always, we start out with who are we talking about in this chapter. Well, there's two events that actually happens. We have the census that is taken, and then we have the result of that census, the plagues that came upon Israel. So as we look at those people that are concerning in the census, we have, of course, the Lord, David, and Joab, and the captains of the army. When we look at the events of the plague, again, we see David, we see Gad the seer, we see the angel of the Lord, and we see Aruna, the Jebusite. I apologize for the way I pronounce names, I'm just not good at it. And then as far as the locations goes, there's a lot of locations here. And all of these deal with the census that was taken. I'm sorry, I got the cotton mouth again tonight. But the cities and the areas that are mentioned here, we have Dan, Beersheba, the River Jordan, Aurora, whatever it is. Gad, Gezer, Gilead, Dan, Jaon, Sidon, Tyre, cities of the, my thing got messed up here. Cities of the Hivites, and we have South Judah, and we have the cities of the Canaanites, Jerusalem, Israel, and Judah. Now, I have to admit, I put these together quickly today, and I did a lot of update, delete, so I'm not sure what I've got here tonight. So, but anyway, these are the cities that are mentioned in the taking of the census. Now, as far as the locations concerning the plague, we have Israel, Dan, Beersheba, Jerusalem, and the threshing floor of Aruna, the Jebusite. Now, I tried to get a couple maps here, and I don't know if you can see that or not. But let's talk a little bit, we'll probably just go ahead and talk a little bit about the taking of the census at the first part of the class, because they've got the maps already up here and what have you. But two things that are mentioned in the taking of the census as far as locations is that the mention is of the area of the Canaanites and the Hivites, or the Hivites, and then we have all the other cities of Israel and Judah that are mentioned. And as far as the location of the area of the Canaanites and the Hivites, let me get my pointer here, is that the Hivites is kind of right in the center of, here we go again, this thing works when it wants to, it's kind of like me. The Hivites is located right here. And this particular map shows the Canaanites being divided in between them. I guess it was a little strip of land here that may connect the two cities, but this was the only map I could find quickly today that shows the area. So when the census was taken, it says that they went through the area or the location of the Canaanites and the Hivites. Then, as far as the nation of Israel itself, and I know this is kind of hard to see, but what we're seeing is the route that Joab and his captains took to make that trip. I know you can't read the names of the cities because the map has to be kind of large, but it begins down here in Jerusalem, crosses the river Jordan over to Aurora, or Aroer, in the area of the region of Gad, and he travels through Gad and Gilead up to through Dan, and up to Sidon, up here at the very top of the nation. Then from Sidon, he goes down to Tyre. Then from Tyre down through the northern country, through the area of the Canaanites, through the Hivites, to the Canaanites, and then down to the bottom to behave yourself. Down here at the bottom, we have Beersheba, and I have everything popping up there. So Beersheba is right down here at the bottom, and then back to Jerusalem. So as David Pratt said in his lesson, or in his book, that what he was doing was taking a counterclockwise route through the nation. And this is kind of how it laid out, or at least how I traced it out on the map when I was reading the events. So this is how it looked, and give or take a little bit, but anyway, I thought that would be of interest to us. Now, when we look at this particular chapter, even though there's two events, of those two events, we see in verse 1 that God's anger was aroused against Israel. Also, in 2 through 9, we see that David takes the census of the people. And 10 through 14, we see David's sins and God's judgment. 15 and 16, we see that God is enraged and kills 70,000 Israelites with the plague. And in verse 17, David pleads for Israel. And then in 18 through 25, David regains God's favor with the burnt offerings. So this is how the chapter's kind of laid out to us. Now, some preliminary thoughts as we get into this. The taking of a census really is not wrong if it's done for the right reasons. Now, when we look in Numbers chapter 1, we see a census being taken by Moses with the people. Verse 3, it states the purpose of this census was concerning the preparations for war. So the people needed to be numbered, and God told Moses how to do it. This also explains why women are not included in the census and males under 20 were not included. Numbers 45 and 46, we see the results of it. It says we have a total number of 603,550 men that were able to go to war. And then we're told in verses 49 through 50 that the Levites were not counted in the census. So we see this particular census being taken by Moses, and it was taken for the right reason. Now, when we look at the reason David was taking this particular census, we kind of get the idea that it was to boost or boast about his own power over the size of the nation that he ruled, and that did not really give God the glory for what he has done for David. Also, I think we see a violation of the law of Moses during the taking of this census. But as it was for the purpose, as we will see, this is the purpose for David's census. It was a temptation that he succumbed to and quickly realized his sin. Now, he probably had it linger in the back of his mind, how great of a nation am I over? And probably never really moved to do it, but then something happened, moved David, and he took that census. Now, the way the census was to be taken, we go back to Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 12. He said, the Lord said to Moses, when you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. So there was a process of census taking and what was required during the taking of that census. We do not see that in verse 24, and when David chose the plague, I think it kind of fell right back into what the requirements of the law of Moses was if you did not give that ransom for himself when you're counting. So censuses was all right to do, and it was a process to take. David just did it for the wrong reasons, and I think he did it with the wrong process. So let's take a look at the chapter. Now, the chapter starts out giving us all kinds of problems. As we see in verse 1 of 24, it says, again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel when he moved David against them, to say, go number Israel and Judah. Now, the problem we have with that is that when you go look at the parallel passage over in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, it says, now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So the question is, was it God that moved David, or was it Satan that moved David? Or is there a third reason? Were they both responsible for the movement of David? That's, it's kind of hard to explain what had happened here, but I look at chapter 24 with two things on God's sight that need to be taken care of. He says that he was aroused against Israel for evidently something they had done against God. So he had an issue with Israel that needed to be corrected, the nation itself. But I also think that since he moved David to do this, he saw something in David's life that needed to be corrected also. If David was beginning to have the beginnings of pride and boastfulness about his life, if left unchecked, it could probably go to a point of consuming him where it would be no return. So God was probably saying, Israel's got a problem, David's got a problem, now I'm going to address both of them at the same time and try to take care of this. I think he was taking care of the nation, trying to see them, get them back on the track that they needed to be, and they also trying to get David to look at his particular life. Now, the passage says that God moved David. He didn't order David to do this. Now, he moved him. Now, to kind of get you an idea of what moving means, you know, sometimes when I go over to Jenna's house, she's got these big old mules for dogs in her house. And sometimes they're in a way when you're trying to get to a chair to sit down, so you kind of have to kick them a little bit to get them to move, and then they'll get up and they'll wander off and you sit down. So it's not something that he commanded David to do, but he had him nudged him in a particular way to see if he's going to move. Now sometimes those dogs won't move. Sometimes you have to hit them pretty hard to get them to move. But the thought is that if David's heart was correct before God, if he was moved or nudged, he would have not moved. But if it was incorrect with God, when that movement happened, he would have went that direction. So I see this movement that God made against David as a checking of David's attitude of heart. Now, did God do it or did Satan do it? Well, as we look at this, you know, whatever happens in this creation happens by God's control. Now, whether or not God was actually the one to nudge David or Satan, it's easy, I think, to understand. Because there are a couple of examples when God says that he does something, but the actual happening is done by someone else. For example, in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 17, it says that God gave his son as a sacrifice for our sins. Well, he didn't make the sacrifice, but he provided Jesus, or put him in a position where he provided the means and the opportunity for the wicked men to complete the act. So God gave Jesus, but he did not do the sacrifice. It was done by someone else. Same thing with Job. When Satan approached Job, and God said, take a look at my servant Job. You know, he's an upright man. There's nothing you can do to make him sin. He said, well, you take this hedge down and let me deal with him, and then I can get him to curse your name. Well, move Job, let's see what happens. So we know the story behind Job. Satan kicked him pretty hard, couldn't get him to move. Now, what we're seeing here is that God allowed a situation to happen, and the medium that takes place was done through Satan. Probably said, take a look at David. David's got a problem. Let's see if he will do something. Satan said, I'll take care of it, and does it. So it may be that God controls everything that happens, and when he pulled his protection away from David, that's when Satan took advantage of the situation, because I guess in Satan's mind was, if I can get David to sin to the extent that I can capture him as one of my servants, I have gained something. And so when it says in 2 Samuel, the Lord moved against David, and First Chronicles said that Satan moved against David, I think we can rationalize it in that particular way. Now, he didn't say, as I said earlier, God did not command David to go number Israel, but he gave them the opportunity to do that, and David fell for the bait, so to speak. Now, when David approached Joab over in verse 3. He says, now may Joab said to the king, well actually in verse 2, let me go back there. He commands Joab, so the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, now go throughout all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and count the people, that I may know the number of the people. Joab replies, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times more than they are, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does the Lord my king desire this thing? Now, we may ask the question, why did Joab put up a fuss to do this? Did he know something about what David was about to do that was going to create problems in Israel, and that in turn would create problems for him? Or, looking at the character and nature of Joab, he probably just didn't want to do it. Now think about it. Here's a man that's a captain of the whole army of Israel, who's fixing to take all of his captains on virtually a 10-month trip throughout the nation. He's going to leave his army in the hands of understudies. In other words, the army is going to be set back about a year as far as fighting abilities. He's not going to be able to get out there and work with them and get them going in the direction they need to go and keep them up to par. So it could be Joab was thinking, I'm the commander of the army, I've got important work to do. Why are you having me sent throughout this nation bean counting, along with all my captains? So he may have been saying it in a particular way that says, Lord, David, why do you desire this thing? Don't worry about it. The Lord will provide for you. Let me do my job, and if you really want these people counted, why don't you take your scribes and send them through the nation? They don't do anything but write stuff down anyway, and half the time they don't get their numbers right. But be that as it may, we don't know what motivated Joab, but he went. He went with his captains, and as we saw the trip that they went through. It took them 9 months and 20 days, and when they came back to the king, he said Israel had 800,000 valiant men. They drew the sword, and Judah had 500,000. Of course, the numbers are different in Chronicles, and again, I don't know, I can't answer that. But I will say this, is that even though we see a challenge in comparing numbers correctly, it seems like the doctrinal teaching is never in error. So evidently the Hebrews had a problem with their numbers. So it says, David's heart condemned him. So he numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now I pray, O Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. After the event happened, David now realized that he had done something wrong, and he went to God in prayer, asking his forgiveness. Now that's the right thing to do. But God was not finished with David just yet. We can see a problem in our life that needs correcting, but there may be something else existent there that God says, unless you see that and ask for forgiveness of that, then your request is not total. We see a lot of people today that says, I've sinned, and they're talking about one specific sin, but they still got a bag full over here that they're carrying with them. I saw a comic strip the other day, but actually I stumbled on it. And the character was this guy that evidently had some people that did something, or he influenced him. He went out and did something wrong. So of course it was in a Catholic church setting. So he comes up to the confessional booth and he says, Father, I sinned. And he said, well, what did you do, son? He said, I let a bunch of idiots motivate me in doing something when I should have just realized that they're just nothing more than the stupid morons that they are. So he realized he had done a sin based on what they had done, but at the same time, he was not going to forgive these people. And so I look at this and I see God saying, okay, now I'm fixing to take care of Israel with one of the three things that I'm fixing to give you. But David, there's still a problem here that we need to have resolved. Even though you knew you did wrong, the wrong is not going to be completed until we're finished here. So the next morning, David's seer came to him and gives him three options. And of those three options, he says that 7 years of famine, flee 3 months before your enemies, or 3 days of the plague. David chose the plague, knowing that being in the hand of God was far better than being in the hand of his enemies. And it could also be that David was thinking, if I can just tolerate 3 days, I'll be done with this and God's favor will be back on me. But the plague came, and in 3 days' time, 70,000 men had died. And when the angel of destruction came to Jerusalem, God stopped him and said, enough is enough. It was at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. And at this particular time, when David spoke to the Lord, when he saw the angel who was striking the people, and he said, surely I have sinned and I have done wickedly, but the sheep, what have they done? Let your hand be against me and against my father's house alone. Now David, you see, David at the beginning was willing to accept punishment from God, but he was going to let the whole nation suffer along with him. Now when he saw what the nation was going through, it finally, I think, dawned on David that this is really all my problems. I'm the one that needs to be punished and not these people. So you see, David now, I think, sees the big picture of what he has done and who is responsible for it. God took care of two problems. He took care of the problem that he had against Israel, and he took care of the problem that David was, I think, beginning to get more pride in himself than he was willing to give God. So Gad came down to him, told him to build an altar to God, offer up sacrifice, and David did. He goes to Araunah, offers to buy it from him. He says, I'll give it to you. He says, no, I will pay you for it. And he buys it, and he offers these sacrifices up before God. And that ends the plague. So we see that what we're seeing at this last chapter is another event in David's life in which he had some issues that had to be taken care of, and we see God's punishment for whatever reason Israel needed to be punished for. So, what are some lessons that we can learn from this? First of all, don't let pride consume you, or it will be your own destruction. When you transgress God's law, truly repent of your sins and ask God to remove that iniquity from you. Be accepting of the consequences of your actions, and be willing to accept punishment for the good of all. And I kind of think this kind of falls into what Paul was trying to teach the Corinthians about being rather going to court with your brother, just take fault and settle the matter so that peace may exist. And then finally, sacrifice yourself to God is the greatest sacrifice that a person can give. So that kind of concludes that. But when we look at the first couple of chapters of Kings, what we will see is the final death of David, Adonijah, his son, Joab, Shimei, and though not put to death, but he was shamed and put into seclusion, and that was Abiathar the priest. Now, concerning David, as you remember, in his old age, he couldn't stay warm, so the servants got it in their head that they would go find this young girl to serve David, wait on him, and if needed, keep him warm in bed. And that's what they did. Now, one of the questions that kind of comes to mind is, why did they not ask one of the wives of the king to fulfill this function? I don't know. It could be that since they were servants, they didn't have the right to tell a queen or one of the queens or one of the wives that you need to do this. Or it could be that when the servants mentioned this to those that were higher up, they were thinking, you know, this could cause a problem if we ask one above the other. And then it could be that all of these wives were thinking, David's about to die, we're not sure about our future, why should we care at this particular point? We don't know why, right?
Ted, you remember back when he came back to the palace after Absalom had did his thing, that he put the wives in seclusion, and he would have nothing to do with them.
That was the 10 concubines.
Right. So, but I mean, it was a concubine, but I mean, you know, some of the people that he had there were considered concubines and stuff, so if he could have had any of them
And he may not have had anything to do with this situation, it just might have been, thrust upon him. But at any rate, this is what had happened. And so she came and she served David and did whatever function was necessary to her. So in verses 15 through 38, we see Bathsheba talks to David about making Solomon king. We'll talk about the events. Well, Adonijah tried to, sneak in there and try to get the throne. She goes to Solomon before his death and says, you really need to take care of this before you die. And he does. So he gives instructions to his people to take Solomon, put him on his mule, take him to, I forget the name of the city, I'd have to look at it. I'd have to look it up, and I don't know if I have time. I think it's Gahan. But, and along with Solomon goes Nathan the prophet, the Cherethites, the Perethites, Benai, which is his, over his personal guard, all the important people that was necessary to make sure that this happened. So they go there, he's anointed king, and the proclamation is made. So David finally takes care of that before he dies. And then he gives Solomon certain instructions concerning the various people that we're about to talk about. And that's found in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Now, concerning Adonijah, we see in verses 1 through 9 that he tries to exalt himself to the throne and make claim to it before David's death. Now, he makes mention to Bathsheba that he said, the throne is rightfully mine. Now, what that indicates is that usually the throne is given to the eldest son if he's alive. If he's not alive, it goes to the second in line, then the third in line, and the fourth in line, much like what you see over in England. And at this particular point, Adonijah was probably the last living son of David, with the exception of Solomon. Now, if that be the case, then what happens to Adonijah pretty much solidifies Solomon in his position, because at that point there's no other brothers ahead of him for the throne. Now, he exalts himself, tries to take the throne. Then we see in verse 7 that in his doing so, Joab gives him his support as well as Abiathar the priest. Now, Joab was probably thinking David's on his last leg. The nation's fixing to go. I need to support the guy that's going to be most able to do something for this nation. And he himself thought it was going to be Adonijah. So after Solomon is anointed king, he persuades, Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, tries to persuade her to give Abishag for his wife. 1 Kings 2, 13 through 20. Solomon refuses and accuses Adonijah of trying to take the kingdom away from him by this request. And we've talked before about how when a king takes over a nation, if you get the wives and the harem, that kind of solidifies your rule over his throne. You conquer his household, you conquer the man. So Solomon was looking at it from the same way. Abishag was an inheritance to me from David, and by making this request, you might as well give him the throne because that's what he's after. And so he puts him to death. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 22 to 25. That takes care of probably the last living son of David up to Solomon. Now, concerning Abiathar, the priest, we know that he did a great deal of work for David. He suffered for David. He carried the ark for David. He worked for David. He was, he was a good man for David. But in this particular case, when Adonijah tried to take the throne without David's approval, and he gave him his support, that brought the wrath of Solomon down upon him. Now, he probably didn't kill him for this, in which he didn't, but instead, because of what he did for David and the work that he did for the temple, he said, even though you deserve death, he said, you're going to live. Go back to your home, and you're no longer going to serve as a priest. So he was pretty much shamed out of what position he had, and pretty much put into seclusion from the work of the priesthood. Now, concerning Joab, Now, when Joab hears what Solomon had done to Adonijah and Abiathar, he flees to the tabernacle and took hold of the horns of the altar. And he declares that he will die at the altar of God if that be the case. Solomon tells Benaiah to do as Joab desires, slay the man where he stands. He said he's not a man to be trusted. And on top of that, and I should have mentioned this earlier, the instructions that David had given Solomon was to ensure that Joab did not die as an old man, but make sure his death meets with a sword, as well as Shimei's. And that's what happens. Solomon tells Benaiah to do as Joab desires and slay him at the altar. Benaiah first calls Joab out, but he refuses to come, and so he goes in and he kills him where he's at. And he's buried in his home out in the wilderness. Now his death, as we were told, is revenge for what he did to Abner and for what he did to Amasa. Both these men were killed ruthlessly and cold-blooded, and his death was to revenge the death of innocent blood. So Joab meets his end by Solomon's hand. And then Shimei was also told, David also told Solomon that this man does not need to live and die in old age. He needs to meet his end with a sword. Because what he did to me, by the accusations he made against me, by the ridicule that he'd done against God's anointed king of Israel, he did it against me, but he also did it against God. This man needs to be put to death. So Solomon makes a covenant with Shimei. He says, you are worthy of death, but here's what's going to happen. Build your house in Jerusalem, and you stay there. If you cross the brook Kidron, for any reason, you will die. 3 years later, 2 of his servants runs off. He saddles up his mule, and he goes across that brook to the neighboring city, retrieves them, and brings them back. Word gets back to Solomon that this happened. He calls Shimei into his presence. He confronts him. It says, you've broken this covenant between me and you, and now you are going to be put to death, because that was the terms of the agreement. And Shimei was put to death. Now, in conclusion of all that, Joab finally receives his reward for shedding innocent blood. David's oldest son is put to death, leaving Solomon, his only son, known to be alive. Shimei is put to death for breaking his covenant with Solomon and for violating the anointed king of Israel. And Abiathar the priest remained alive, but lived in shame and exile in the temple service. And that leaves Solomon, the anointed king on the throne of David, with no opposition, and the people that had done wickedly under the reign of David, that David, and especially Joab, could not control, has now been brought to their end. And they died old men, even though they died at the sword. So the life of David, from his reign to the end, and the events that kind of hung off to the end, we kind of covered there. And we still got